is Dr. Geer, and this is Unit 6, Chapter 10, the last lecture of the course. This is on legal, ethical, and policy issues. And I'm just going to give you some general thoughts that I have on this chapter, and here are some of the things that I think I would suggest to you that you may want to think about when it comes to legal, ethical, and policy matters. One of the questions that I think you as potential educational leaders continually have to ask yourself is the question of, are you willing to pay the price of being held to a higher standard and to live in something of a fishbowl at times, because as an educational leader, the principal, the assistant superintendent, the superintendent, whatever role you take on, you will be the focus of the community and your staff. So one of the things I would have you consider, and this is something you need to reflect on quite a bit, is the idea that you will be under a microscope and held to a higher standard of behavioral and ethical standards than probably the general population. You have to be willing to accept that. And that gets translated into things like your public behavior. I was in a course one time on the school superintendency, and I can remember the professor, who was a former superintendent, gave us some advice that I think would apply to principals as well. And he said, well, when you're going to a social event, one where you're going to be exposed to your staff or perhaps your community at large, he said, and generally he was, I think, talking about a party or something where things could get a little rambunctious, he would say, go to it late and leave early. And I always thought that kind of summed it up pretty well. One of the things we have to remember is that we're a role model for society as a whole. I can't help but think about that when I was watching the CEO of BP talk about how he wanted to go back to his normal life. Well, quite frankly, if you're going to be a leader of an organization, you have to be willing, when the times get tough, to suck it up and do what you have to do to serve the organization. And I think if he could take those words back today, he certainly would. One of the things that I would have you reflect on is, what are your moral non-negotiables? That is, where are the lines where you are willing at some point to sacrifice even your job because you're put into a situation where ethically this is a situation where you cannot compromise your principles. That's something that I think you need to think about and be prepared to grapple with that idea. In terms of some thoughts on policy, one of the things that I would pose to you is that policy, as I looked at it, always is a guideline. I never looked at it as law, and I'll tell you why. Because when you're dealing with human situations, there's so many extenuating circumstances that you can't possibly write a policy that's going to take all of that into account. So one of the things that I would propose, that when you do write policy, always make sure you leave room for your judgment as a professional and as the human entity in the whole enterprise. Too often I hear people talk about things like a discipline policy, where it is, well, if it's the first offense, then we do this. If it's the second, we do this. If it's the third, we do this. I just think that that's unreasonable. I don't think it's fair generally, because people have different circumstances, and the way that you extinguish behaviors is going to be different from person to person. So with that being said, using discipline policy as an example, make sure that you have room for your judgment as a professional. Further in the the chapter, Rebord talks about lawsuits, and let me give you some advice, and this dates back to the Bible. And basically, avoid lawsuits at all costs. But I will tell you this. Here's what you're going to hear when you become an educational leader. Well, you're going to hear from my lawyer. Well, the first couple times that you hear that come out of somebody's mouth, it is a bit disconcerting. But 99.99% of the time, that is an empty threat. Generally, people won't follow up on that type of threat. And, try to avoid lawsuits at all costs. Obviously, they're time-consuming, resource-consuming, monetarily, they're very expensive, and really, the only people who make out in a lawsuit are the attorneys generally. But one of the things that I would say to you is this, is if you ever get to the point where you are involved in a lawsuit or have to make recommendations, say to a Board of Education regarding a lawsuit, one of the things that I've learned about it is to make sure that you have the financial resources to be able to take it all the way to the courthouse. And by that, I mean that is a long, drawn-out process. It usually takes a couple years from the inception of the lawsuit to the time it might get to court. So you have to be prepared to play that out because attorneys will tell you this, that most lawsuits are settled on the courtroom, on the courthouse steps. By the time we get that far, most times people don't want to take it to a jury or a judge. They're going to try to get a settlement through insurance or some other form, and usually there's some serious negotiations at that point. Another thing that I would suggest you as a school administrator, and this is at any level, is you have to continue to be updated all the time on law. It changes constantly. For instance, think of the changes that are coming down the pike with NCLB. There are state court cases that are ruled on all the time, Supreme Court cases in the U.S. Supreme Court that will change the playing rules. Let me give you an example. When I first became superintendent of schools, a local church group asked to use our pool for full immersion baptisms. Well, at that period of time when that request came in, that was unconstitutional because of separation of church and state. But subsequent to that time period, another court decision came that would now allow that to occur. So my point is that the conditions change consistently in this realm. In terms of the PowerPoint, I have no other things to add to it, and I hope that you'll consider the moral non-negotiables and the cognitive anchors that will guide your decision making as an educational leader. Keep in mind that you have to stay to the high ground, doing what's best for the students who are in your charge, and if you fall to that side of an equation to make decisions that are best for children, you're doing your job. And with that, I would also add that when you get into a situation where it is a dilemma and you can't really decide what the best path is when it comes to students, I would also kind of rely on the Hippocratic oath, which is do the least harm.